Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. Today I have for you a great quilt pattern that uses both Kaffe facet fabrics and shirt fabrics from the thrift store, and you're gonna love it. And I have a lot to say about it. So let's do it. So I did a fabric pull on these Kaffe facet fabrics that are in the warm family. So the reds and pinks and oranges and burgundies. And I love those fabrics and got inspired by Leah Louise YouTube channel. And she did a quilt pattern called Flying Home, which is a free pattern from Moda. And I talked about that in the previous video, but I spent most of my time going over the fabrics that I chose. Well, those fabrics and that inspiration has turned into the quilt top that is forming behind me. I have this opinion about quilt patterns and shirt fabrics. And I'm probably not the only one that has it, but it's a somewhat unpopular opinion, which is not every quilt pattern is great for shirts. If you're willing to scrap it up, you can do any pattern in any fabric. But if you really want to just use the fabric that you have, cut it into the shapes that are needed for the quilt pattern, sometimes there are quilt patterns that just don't work as well as others. And this one is a great one. And I love to bring those to your attention because sometimes they're hard to find. So when I started this project, I was wanting to use those Kaffe facet fabrics, and I do love them, and they're beautiful. They can be challenging. And so what I wanted was something that would highlight the beauty and color of those fabrics while still having an interesting and lovely actual quilt pattern. I think probably part of what I liked about it was the blocks that each individual flying goose, I don't think it's flying goose, I think it's flying geese, block is actually fairly large. And so it really is a lot of one type of fabric all together. And usually when that happens, it's not great for shirts because the shirt fabrics are, they're misshapen, well, not misshapen for shirts, but they're misshapen for yardage. And so it can be like striking that balance. Well, let me back up. The thing about this quilt pattern that I think I like more than anything else is that it's a little bit like playing a strategy board game. So if you've ever played Risk or Settlers of Catan and you like creating a plan and you've got your strategy going and you're like losing the game, and then you get in the last 5 minutes and all of your slowly built pieces come together all at once and you go boom, victory point, boom, you got your city, boom, and then you win the game in like the last 5 minutes, just out like dark horse out of nowhere. That is what this quilt pattern is like. The way the pattern is actually laid out, it is very, very clear. And in the pattern itself, it calls for pieces that you cut to make 4 at a time, no waste, flying geese. You had me at no waste. I like the way snowballs look, but you end up with so much waste, etc., etc. So the idea of making flying geese, which I had not done before, and not wasting any fabric, which is very important when you have really lovely fabrics like Kaffe, was very appealing. And the instructions are clear and simple and easy to follow. So even a beginner, I feel certain, could do this. And the pieces that you make the 4 at a time, no waste flying geese out of, are actually piece sizes that are manageable for a shirt. So let me show you that. So I have this one all pinned up. This is actually half of the square that you start with, and I'm going to put it on my I almost said cutting board. I call it a cutting board. Bless my heart. It is a 9¼ inch square. Now that is not a small square, but it just so happens that you can get easily a 9½ or 9¼ in this case square out of each sleeve of a shirt, and plenty of them from the back and the two fronts. I decided in my fabric pool that I was going to use a mixture of Kaffe fabrics, and I had a bunch of really vibrant shirts from the thrift store, and so it called for 20 of these 9¼ inch square blocks. And so I doubled up on my Kaffe and then filled in the gaps with my shirt fabrics, and was just surprised to no end. I mean, I used one sleeve for each shirt, and I still have that whole shirt left to go. Which, pro tip, if you're going to use thrifted shirts in your quilting, you do not have to do this, but this is what I have learned. If you can work those sleeves first with a pattern that, like this one, you could have 20 shirts or 10 shirts and use each sleeve. I mean, you could use as many or as few shirts as you want, but you're going to end up with 20 of these 9¼ inch squares. If you use your sleeves first, then you have a ton of fabric that's in a big block still left for your stash. So if you are anticipating loving this fabric and using it down the road, you save the big pieces for some quilt pattern as yet to be determined, and if it calls for an even bigger piece, you have the fabric for it. And those sleeves are kind of funky because of the shape, so if you can use them first and get everything that you need out of it, it's like a win-win. So you get those kind of wonky pieces out of the way, and you get those big blocks saved. So back to my strategy board game and this quilt pattern. You thought I had forgotten. I didn't forget. Because you make the flying geese 4 at a time, no waste. If you cut all of your fabrics and all of your 5-inch background pieces and get them all lined up and sew them, chain piece them, you go from having no flying geese to having 80 flying geese, just like that. It's the craziest thing. Now, I'm notorious for, I can't stand it. I want to cut into my fabric and see what it's going to look like. So I did 3 or 4 here, 4 or 5 there, but I didn't put them on the design wall. I just kind of had them to the side. If I was a normal person and had just cut all my fabric like a normal person and then lined it all up and chain piece them, really, it's like you go from having nothing done to, oh my goodness, the whole quilt top is almost done. It's made in 4 quadrants. So if you can see behind me, obviously we couldn't fit even half the quilt on, because it's kind of big, on my design wall. It's a big quadrant, and then it's just rotated on itself, which makes that little windmill effect kind of thing in the center, and we'll show a picture of that. So it starts off with just these kind of oddly laid out flying geese. So it's really a tessellation is what it is. So it's the quadrant, and then you turn it 90 degrees. No, what would that be? 90 degrees, and then 90 degrees again, and then 90 degrees again. That's how it makes that really lovely design. We had a geometry lesson there. P.S. I'm an algebra person, not a geometry person. So sometimes, like, I love quilting and I love the math, but sometimes I get the like, is that right? But the point being, you go from no flying geese to 80 flying geese to a quadrant to a whole quilt top just in the blink of an eye. And before I move on from talking about the shirt fabrics, of course, challenged myself. I really need to stop doing that. It's really getting out of hand. To use all shirts for the background. And there's a lot of background. And I did that on purpose because sometimes people will say, how many shirts do you need for XYZ? And I shy away from quilts a lot of times with a lot of background fabric for the sake of using shirts, because it's motors through them so fast, and also sometimes it is hard to get those big pieces. These pieces that are in between, I feel like I need to turn and look. So in between the flying geese, in each quadrant are 4 rectangular blocks that are 8.5 by 12.5. And I knew it was going to be a stretch doing that with a shirt. And so I wanted to see, I knew I could do it. I just didn't know how many shirts I would need. And when I started, I was very thorough. And I was being very conservative with my cutting and very thoughtful. And as I got into it, I was less careful and did not keep as good of a count. And as I was breaking down my shirts, I was very impatient and cut holes in 2. At least one of them. So one of the backs ended up having darts in it, which is annoying. And when I went to seam rip the darts, I just got a little too reapy with my seam reaper, and it was death to fabric. And so I wasn't able to use that shirt back for these big pieces. I ended up having to use it for the 5-inch squares. So if I had been a little more thoughtful all the way through the process, I really think I could have done it with 3 shirts. As it is, I'm 2 shirts in, and I have, I think, 7 more of these big pieces still to go. So I wanted to show you, this may be a stretch. Let me see which side it'll show best on. This is a pocket right here. This piece came from the front left placket of the, that's right, yes, front at a moment. And some people have asked me about these holes where the seams are for the pockets. They're usually especially big because they're reinforced there. I do not worry with them, and they come out in the wash every time. There are times I'm like, ooh, I don't know, that's a pretty big hole, and every time. So I just pretend like they are not there. So if you've had that thought and you're like, I don't think I want to use that piece because it's got so many holes in it from the needles where it reinforced the pocket, go with courage, because it will wash out in the end quilt. And you can see this piece, for yardage, is not huge, but for a shirt is pretty big. So I was able to get 1 and sometimes 2 out of the left front placket and 4 out of the back of a shirt. You have to get clever with it. And so I did discover that unless your shirt is exceedingly large, which I think mine were just large and extra large, unless it's a double XL, the right side it's hard to get more than 1 piece out of, because it's a little narrower. You lose where the buttonholes are, and a lot of times it's not 8.5 inches wide. I know that seems surprising, but it's true. I really think if you're thoughtful, you can get all of the background fabric out of 3 shirts. So just know that. And recently on Patreon, one of the patrons asked me if I do anything to make sure that my white shirts match each other. Like, do I use the same kind of shirts? Or she made the remark that it just looks like white fabric. And I don't, I just buy white shirts. And I guess that's the beauty of white shirts. I do wash them sometimes in OxyClean to make sure they're very, very white. And I wash them on hot. But otherwise, they just, like, you just don't look at it and go, that's 3 different white fabrics. I have yet to have anybody even notice. So they just come across like white fabrics. So another pro tip. So just know you can do it with shirts. It isn't as easy. So yardage would be far easier, but it can be done with this quilt pattern. Moving on, the 4 at a time, no waste. I have to say the whole thing now. It's kind of ridiculous. 4 at a time, no waste flying geese. I did learn that when you do this step, it starts as that big piece with the 5-inch square, and then now this has been cut and I'm going to the next step. The first one that I sewed from this direction going this direction. In case you're not familiar with this method, you essentially sew a 1/4 inch to each side of the line. So it's your piece, and then the 5-inch square marked down the center with pins, and then you sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this side and then a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this side. And I started, so here's my sewing machine, I started this way. It's not a problem, but because these pieces are folded and this is going kind of against and over that seam, it can pull as it goes through your machine and not lie as flat if you start on this side. So what I found worked better was to start on the thinner side with just 2 fabric widths, depths, thicknesses. So what I'm saying here is sew right along that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then once you get to here, you can turn it around and go this way, and it's been anchored down on this side, so it's less likely to pull against that seam that it's overlapping, if that makes sense. Sometimes there's a little, you have to do a little wiggle to get your 5-inch square lined up where the center, that center line goes right through the middle of it, and then also it just is right through the middle of where those 2 folds come together. So if you have that experience, I do not want you to feel like you're alone, like, oh, this is not exactly square. So I shimmied it some in some places, and then some of them I just prayed on the trimming feature, which, let's talk about that. When you go to trim, so this is what comes out of this right here. This gets seamed on either side and then cut right down the middle, and then this folds back and becomes that right there. Isn't that just math? I love it. My very first 2 or 3 that I did, to cut them, to trim them to size, which that final size is 8.5 by 4.5, I lined this up on this edge. Now, I use my mat. I use my mat and my ruler together. I've had so many people, or I've seen so many tips like use your ruler. Not, I can't do it. I don't know. It's a mental thing. But I like to use my ruler and my mat in tandem. So what I would do is I'd line it up against the edge and then trim on this side, which makes a lot of sense because it's a nice big, you know, swath of fabric right there. But I learned what you're really trying to do with flying geese is get all these flying geese to line up together where the points match or come to that edge. And to do that, the distance from this little point right here to this edge needs to be the same seam allowance that you use. If that's a scant 1/4 inch, then it needs to be cut at a scant 1/4 inch. If you're a full 1/4 inch, awesome. If you are not great about holding your 1/4 inch seam allowance, you might want to give yourself some more wiggle room. Wriggle. It's even better than wiggle room. Wriggle room. So what I learned to do is instead now I line this edge on my 4.5 inch mark. You can see here's my 4.5. I love this ruler. I don't promote a lot of products. I love this ruler. It is Creative Grids Bias Binding Simplified. I use this thing constantly, and it just so happens that this ruler has a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance marked on the whole length of the ruler. And I'm going to sit it down here, and you can see there's actually this nice black bar, which they did to explain something that I've never read, but I use it up against white fabric. Look at that. Oh, amazing. So what I did when I learned to trim, which I resent trimming, I'll be honest with you, I resent trimming, or I used to, and now I'm like, oh, this covers a multitude of sins. Trimming is your friend. Let's all, for Thanksgiving, let's all be thankful for trimming. And I'm not talking about at the dinner table. I'm talking about trimming your blocks. So I line my ruler. You do not have to have this ruler to do this. You can use a straight edge. You can use whatever ruler you have. But if you mark your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's where you trim. And so I'm trimming off this little section right here. And now when I go to sew my flying geese together, it's right where I want it to be. And then, you know, same here. I'm going to measure this out to 8.5. Another tip, let me put this a little further down the road so you can see it. If it's a little too big, this one is actually remarkably close to 8.5. And you're gonna need to cut a little bit off. Don't just slide it to one side, because then your points won't come together in the center on your final quilt. They'll be just a little bit off. So what you do is the whole block is 8.5. So half of that, which puts you at the center, is 4.25. So I'm looking at 4.25, and I would just put the center of this little point. So that's the center of that block on the 4.5, and now I can trim here and here if there was an overhang, which there is. For that, there's your little dog ear from the seam, which I can cut off. And now I know that that is, ooh, I did not do a great job cutting that on camera. Fantastic. But now I know that that is centered because I put that point right at the 4.25 mark. Does that make sense? I did that a lot actually as I was getting these together, just making sure that I had it centered. And you know, ideally you want your flying geese, you want your points to show, you want your points to line up, etc., etc. But if they don't, who cares? I mean, really, it's really no big deal. Like, we got big problems in the world, and points on flying geese are not it. So let's just, you know, if you get the quilt top put together and then get it all basted and then quilted and bound, I mean, hero, you're a hero. So like, don't even worry about it. When you come to the stage where you start sewing your flying geese together, I haven't talked about that quilt pattern. It's so great. It's so great that I just want to talk about the specifics of how I did it. That's so funny. It actually is laid out very well. The pattern is, it's not very long. It's 4 total pages, and it includes instructions if you don't have enough fabric to do the 4 at a time. So if you wanted to do just this one little flying goose, it gives you the directions for that as well. So if you found yourself short on shirt fabric, for example, you can do just a part of it and not have to worry about, well, I don't have a 9.25 inch square, so I can't do it. Psh, you got it. So in my final quilt, these two are going to go together just like this. The trick that I learned about sewing these together is, as you know, we did the top to bottom situation. I actually pieced these with red bobbin thread, which is a little different. I usually just use white top and bottom, but I had a whole bobbin full of red thread, and I thought, I'm never going to use this. And most of these pieces have a significant amount of red in it. So it just so happens that works in our favor, because I want to demonstrate one more thing, and then we will wrap it up and call it a day. You can see right here where my red seam allowance, my red seam is, and my variable seam allowance, mostly 1/4 inch. And I trimmed it right here. Now, if you go to sew these and you're sewing along with your sewing machine, just like this, and you go to what would be my left of that X, you will not have points on your flying geese. It really is Just that simple. You have to be to the right ever so slightly of that X. So people who are like, they turn their blocks over like, oh yay, my points. You know when you're sewing it. It's not a mystery. If you're to the right of that little X, that's where your point is, right there. So you have to be just ever so slightly to the right, because remember, when you fold it back and press it, you lose a little bit of fabric in the fold. So when you go to sew, you want to make sure you use a scant seam allowance, or you just watch it closely. And it's kind of like driving on a country road that the striping has come off the road and it's anybody's guess where your lane is, like a 2-lane road. If you've been driving for a while, you know where you can imagine where the paint stripe would be. You know the center of the road. You can imagine. And even though your car hasn't gotten there yet and you're not watching the road go underneath your car, you can anticipate that your car is going to stay in this section, and that's where that's the yellow dotted line of the road. That's what it's like sewing these. You don't have to mark them. You just kind of imagine, like just think of the road, and as you're sewing this, you just kind of track out, like, here's our dotted line. Oh wait, I am going to be on the wrong side of the X. I've got my wheel over the line. So as you're sewing, you can just cheat that fabric just a little bit so that you get to the right side of the X, literally the right side of the X. And if you do that, then when you open it up and press it, you'll have your points. So just a little trick that I learned on my very first time doing flying geese, but I did 80 of them. So I feel like I have a little more knowledge than I did when I started. As far as the quilt pattern goes, just fun. It's fun and it comes together well. And I can imagine using a variety of shirts. This is one of those that you could make as a blue and white quilt. You could do each row of flying geese are a different one. So you could have polka dots and stripes and and flowers, and I tend to want to say flowers and floral at the same time, and it kind of comes out weird in my mouth. You could do a whole variety of shirts, and I think it would be really interesting and lovely. And while we're here, and before I forget, when you have stripes, if you do 4 at a time, some of them will be on the horizontal axis and some of them will be on the vertical axis. In my case, I use that to my advantage, and all of the ones that are vertical I used in the center windmill section, so they're pointing out at the point. On the corner sections, I used the horizontal ones. Now, I'm a little precise, you may have noticed, and so I like those sorts of subtle order. Obviously, no need to do that if you don't want to, but if you're using shirts and you're going to do stripes and you want all your stripes to be the same way, either you don't do the 4 at a time, or you plan on these 4 in the center will be horizontal and the ones in the corners will be vertical. Anyway, as if it matters. Again, no one cares. Just make a beautiful quilt and go get this pattern because it's free on moda.com. It's a bake shop, whatever that means. I think it's because it's you can use a layer cake. So if you're coming here and you're not a shirt user yet, you can get you a layer cake of Kaffe and your shirts and use them together because they actually play well together, and you get all that wonderful white background around your really vibrant Kaffe fabrics and end up with a really pretty quilt. I hope this has been helpful for you. I hope you enjoy getting out there and trying all different kinds of quilt patterns with your shirt fabrics. This one is a good one, so check it out. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.